Hello and welcome to my summary and commentary of Part 9 of the introduction of Volume 1 of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. In this section, he speaks more about his admiration for Göthe and how Göthe has influenced his comparative morphology. And he also tells us a bit more about what he thinks about his conception of Copernican world history, as opposed to these prior, what he calls Ptolemaic world histories, in that in those histories, every other culture revolves around the West, very similar to a heliocentric view of the solar system, where everything, a geocentric view of the solar system, where everything would revolve around the Earth. So, he says, his Copernican form of the historical process, rather than all these arbitrary and narrow schemes, lies deep in the essence of the historical process and reveals itself only to an eye perfectly free from prepossessions, so a perfectly unbiased eye. An eye that views all of the high cultures equally. Again, Spengler has this doctrinaire relativism. No culture is better or worse than another, and no culture can understand another culture more than any other culture can. They're all equally ignorant of each other, equally on this apophatic abyss from each other, this abyss of knowledge, of total impossibility of understanding this other person, much like when a modern postmodernist or neo-Marxist invokes the idea of lived experience to tell any person that they just simply cannot understand or empathize with the situation of another person because of whatever immutable characteristics or, whatever fault line the neo-Marxists are trying to divide American society on that particular day. So he also says that Göthe possessed such an eye free from any prepossessions. And what Göthe called living nature is here called world as history. So this is, again, his big dichotomy between world as nature, kind of the Kantian view of things, and then world as history, looking at things through this Goethean living nature comparative morphology approach. And Göthe, who as artist portrayed the life and development of the thing becoming and not the thing become. And he brings up Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, so a very famous novel by Göthe that's quite celebrated. I hope to read it sometime soon. I bought myself a big collected works of Göthe so I could look into his quote-unquote scientific writings. I'm sorry to use scare quotes here, but I think they're certainly in order here. But yeah, so I've been looking into that, and Wilhelm Meister is included therein, so I'll look forward to reading that as time permits. And so he brings that up, and he says, Göthe hated math and world as mechanism. He wanted world as nature, or world as history, even in his studies of natural history or of biology. Göthe was motivated by studying the plant as it develops and things of that nature. So he says, as naturalist, every line meant to display the image of the thing becoming. And this is true, but And I'm going to do a video specifically on some of Goethe's scientific essays, which will be in another playlist. But once I have that done, I'll hopefully edit the description of this video and include a link there. But so this is true. This is Goethe's process. But let's just speak a bit more about what Spengler says of it. So he says, there's an immediate and inward certainty and an intellectual flair, as opposed to these fuddy-duddy systematic approaches to science. So yeah, and, this helps us see the secrets of the phenomenal world in motion. Now these are the means of historical research, precisely these and no others. So again, as much as as Spengler has this kind of relativistic approach to all the cultures, when it comes to historical methodology, he could not be more absolutist and more exclusivist. His is the exclusive and absolute method for understanding history. Is that consistent with his Copernican approach, with his relativistic attitude? Well, we'll see. At the end of this little section, maybe he does find a way to thread this needle, to square this circle. But that's all in the eye of the beholder, and I leave it to your discretion once we've gotten there. And he says, Göthe had a godlike insight at the Battle of Valmy. So the Battle of Valmy, as the editor shows in the footnote to this page, was a big battle in 1792, so this is La Grande Armée, or actually maybe that army had not yet been formed, because Napoleon, I'm not sure if Napoleon was yet leading the forces, but he was on his way, and geez, I was just discovering how young Napoleon was when he gained control of the French armed forces and then the French state. He was still in his 20s, which is quite remarkable, but in tumultuous times, those with energy and talent can rise to the top without formalities, without following the typical career path. So, very interesting. But, so this Battle of Valmy, it's, yes, I don't believe it was quite yet Napoleon's army, because it's very early. I mean, the terror hasn't even yet really gone into full gear. That's more 1793. And so it's the post-revolutionary French army, and they defeat a Prussian army, and there might have been a coalition with the Austrians as well, but it looks like it's just the Prussians from this footnote. But so this is very important, obviously, because in 1789, you have the French Revolution. This is kind of this first idea of a democratic government in Europe, a government that is not based on the monarch, right? We have the Habsburg dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty, all these different dynasties, and those were really the important power centers in Europe up until 1789. So we have this epochal event of the French Revolution, the first kind of taste of deep ideology in the West, of, deep democratic ideology. And we get more and more of it through the 19th century, and then we have the disasters caused by German ideologies in the 20th century, communism and Nazism, chief among them. So it's a very important moment, but he says Göthe has a godlike insight there because the Prussians lose at the Battle of Valmy, and Goethe's consoling the troops, and he says to them, "Here and now begins a new epoch of world history, and you, gentlemen, can say that you were there." Now, hindsight's always 20/20. And again, Goethe's motivation was actually more of one of consolation than one of insight or reflection, as the editor points out in the footnote. And as pretty much anybody with common sense would recognize, he's talking to the defeated soldiers and trying to raise their spirit some way. At least this is a historical moment, right? Yeah, you might have been the losers, but hey, it's a big historical moment. But Spengler, in his fetishization of Goethe, I don't think there's any other way to say it. Like, this guy almost, in like a platonic sense, he's got like an erotic connection to Goethe. I mean, the admiration goes so far beyond the rational. It's just pure and utter intellectual love, platonic love here. So I don't know. It's just very interesting. So this is a godlike insight, because for the first time, a Republican-style army, a quote-unquote Republican army, a big mass democratic army, defeated a royal army, a kingly army, or a princely army sometimes, but they were already kings by this point. Earlier on, 15th, 16th century, there were more princes than kings, but that's a deeper subject. I refer you to Philip Bobbitt's Shield of Achilles if you're interested in that work. But, so anyway, what Goethe said at the Battle of Valmy, hindsight's 20/20, but it just doesn't seem all that insightful. Like, the first ever democratic mass army beat a professional royal army. Of course it was an epochal event. I mean, hindsight's 20/20 and all, but it's not like this guy sounds like Nostradamus, okay? So, anyway, and then he praises Goethe's scientific accomplishments, very floridly on the first full paragraph of page 33 of this Arctos edition. And a lot of the things he's praising, I mean, some of them, maybe Goethe has some contributions here, but Goethe is just not well thought of as a scientist by virtually any modern scientist. And he wasn't even that well thought of by scientists in 1918. So again, we just see this fetishization of Goethe, this total man crush. And there's just very little other way to put it without really sugarcoating what we've got going on here. So, and these are all alleged to be examples of destiny and nature and not the causality. So when I really dig in to my summary and commentary of Goethe's scientific work in this, collected works of Goethe that I picked up the other day, we can dig into that a bit more, but there's a lot of problems in Goethe's morphology of plants. I mean, he makes good advances, or advances some good hypotheses, and you've got to understand him for the age he was in, late 18th century, early 19th century. Certainly he's an ambitious man, and he's pursuing things that are valuable. And to the extent he's engaging in a conversation with other scientists and helping them to construct better hypotheses, he's a valuable scientist. But as himself, his ideas just don't add up to much, and they have not influenced modern biology whatsoever. So any reasonable reader can question whether Spengler's whole method is built upon pillars of salt and pillars of sand. On to the next point. So from Goethe, Oswald Spengler develops a form language of human history, its periodic structure, and its organic logic. Organic logic, very important for Spengler. So Spengler posits that human history is similar to that of any other of the higher life groups, and cites the refrain of endless beast legends, sagas, and fables as evidence for that. And moreover, he cites the deeply felt relationship of plant destiny and human destiny that is an eternal theme of all lyrical poetry as another big piece of evidence. So this shows us more about Spengler's comparative morphological approach, how important the evidence from art history is for Spengler in drawing conclusions. Now, I myself, I'm not sure that this is a totally warranted conclusion, and again, we might have some Mott and Bailey phenomenon here. I'm not, accusing Spengler of using these tactics intentionally, but to the extent he's just saying that each human culture is like an organism and has a lifespan, okay, that's certainly true, and that's a very fruitful idea, and that's why people come back to this work, because that's a fascinating idea. But to the extent you're going to make any maximal interpretation, any strong interpretation of that hypothesis, you're going to run into a lot of problems with your empirical observations and the nature of a culture and a civilization as much as it's reflected in physical artifacts. And you can compare here the extended phenotype by Richard Dawkins, because, even the beaver makes dams and things like that. So we have human culture and civilization represented through physical artifacts to some degree. but it's a much deeper spiritual thing, or it's an immaterial thing. At the very least, we can call it an incorporeal being, a culture or a civilization. And as I've discussed before, we can also compare Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Lindy effect here. A book, even though it has a physical instantiation in each copy of the book, and even in each electronic copy of the book, each is a physical instantiation of some sort, but the book itself is an incorporeal idea. And what we see again and again is that the books that are the oldest are the books that tend to last the longest. The whatever New York Times bestseller that you've got in some airport lounge today probably isn't going to be around in a year. But the Bible has been around for more than 2,000 years, and we can easily expect it to be around for 2,000 years more. So the incorporeal nature of a culture and a civilization, it's a hugely important matter when comparing a plant, which is it's just physically there. There's nothing truly spiritual or incorporeal about it, other than, well, even the DNA within it is not truly incorporeal. So, and obviously Goethe didn't yet know about DNA, neither did Spengler. But from the frame of reference we have here in 2023, it would be neglectful not to mention these things, and even if they couldn't have understood it at their time. So yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of problems with what he's saying right here, and yeah, so I mean, to the extent you want to support him and argue back against me, please leave something in the comments. I'd be happy to see if you have a good argument in favor of his approach here, or in favor of him not even addressing the question of whether, well, a culture, as much as it has physical instantiations, is in itself, a spiritual, incorporeal thing. It's an idealistic thing. It is mostly composed of the ideas within any individual within the culture, and how that conversation in the culture goes, and how those ideas influence the development of each person and the production of those physical artifacts. So these ideas, unlike the physical artifacts, are not... It stands to reason that they are not as susceptible to mortality, that something that is incorporeal can last much longer than something that is physically instantiated in a body. But Spengler, in my reading of his work, I've read all of Volume 1, all of Volume 2, I've read all of Man and Technics, I've read all of The Hour of Decision, and I have not seen him truly deal with this distinction for all these dichotomies that he just loves, his Gegenbegriffe. He never addresses the idea of, well, is a culture as a largely incorporeal being, as a fundamentally incorporeal being, because he's always talking about the soul of the culture, the spirit of the culture, should that in any way influence the lifespan that it should have? Or, because he's compared these 8 or 9 high cultures, does he just say, well, I've already applied my comparative morphological approach, and it's, my reasoned conclusion that every culture does have a lifespan. But then again, how do you explain things like the Tang Dynasty, and the Song Dynasty, and the Ming Dynasty, right? Because he thinks China already went into its phase of civilization and essentially died by the end of the Han Dynasty, which is the first long-lived dynasty in Chinese history, about 200 BC to about 200 AD. But you have these later Chinese dynasties that are domestically Chinese. Yes, they have relations with the outside world through the Silk Road. Chang'an at the time, Xi'an today, was the terminus of the Silk Road, a hugely important city, probably the greatest metropolitan city in the world at that time. And it's just hard to square a lot of the empirical observations with Spengler's grand theories, as much as he, tells us again and again that he is without prepossessions, that he is just following where his analogies lead. But how much can anybody be free from any prepossessions? Well, maybe he addresses that at the end of this section. So the next point, he says, drawing analogies between the most relevant evidence from each high culture as the evidence works upon the imagination rather than forming it into a ready-made scheme. So in his view, he's not done anything with a ready-made scheme. Everything is just all these facts that he's seen, and they're just working upon his imagination. You ask yourself how much you truly believe that, but... And then he says, now we can use terms youth, growth, maturity, decay as objective descriptions of organic states. Objective descriptions, youth, growth, maturity, decay, rather than subjective sociological valuations. So, I mean, maybe. I mean, to some extent, I think he does accomplish these things, or seems to, but you've got to look at some later guys like Arnold Toynbee, who I haven't really read, Carroll Quigley, who I haven't really read, Samuel P. Huntington, who I am reading now, and I'm learning a lot from Samuel P. Huntington. This guy, he really knew a lot, and it's a damn shame that Clash of Civilizations, people don't engage with it as much, because they didn't like a lot of his conclusions. I'm about halfway through that book. That's a book I think, I would highly recommend that to you, probably more than Decline of the West at this point, just because it's so much shorter, it's so much clearer, you're going to waste a lot less time on Huntington. Now, like for someone like me who likes to engage with ideas and see who has the better of the argument, things like that, Spengler's very good because he has this superficially very, very attractive methodology, and I would say system as well. He would revolt against that term, But so you've got this guy with this kind of superficially very, very attractive system and method, but there's a lot of holes in it the deeper you dig. So that's fun for a guy like me, but not everybody's going to want to wade through 1,000 pages just to conclude, this guy's a little bit of just another Gnostic German philosopher. So it is a bit disappointing when you really get down to brass tacks with this guy. So, on to the next point. He's going to set each culture beside the others as a self-contained phenomenon. This is becoming a recurring theme, right? In his Copernican approach, each of the cultures is like a planet, and they're all revolving around world history, we could think of it. And they're revolving around that because that's the true form. They're just actualities, right? They're just actualities, but the true form is what any organism going through a lifespan is going to have. So it's going to have a religious idea that creates the high culture and that brings unity and vitality to it. And then that religious idea slowly but surely loses force over the course of time, as he thinks it's very specific, that it has to be just about 1,000 years, like that. You are on the clock as soon as that great religious idea to deal with world fear and death fear comes. You're basically on the clock for about 1,000 years, and then that culture is going to have no more vitality. But you've got counterexamples like the Indian and the Chinese, and you've got guys like Arnold Toynbee and others, Huntington, Quigley, and many more, who try to deal with this in perhaps a deeper manner, but perhaps not. Perhaps you're quite satisfied with what you see here. So he says they're each a self-contained phenomenon embodying and expressing their own soul. Each culture, self-contained phenomenon embodying and expressing its own soul. So that self-contained nature, this also ties into that deep apophatic abyss between these cultures for Spengler. That you can't understand another culture whatsoever, unless you're Spengler, I guess. But, well, and let's get to the point where he kind of tempers this. So he says, then we can determine what is necessary in the riot of incident. So this is a nice Spenglerism, the riot of incident. He's trying to tease out. So this is actually kind of a trichotomy, because the dichotomy is destiny versus causality. So he he views destiny as applying to world as history and causality applying to world as nature. But then there's this third category, which we might think of as randomness or coincidence, and he calls incident. So the riot of incident, these are going to be things that affect the actuality of any culture, how it expresses itself, how it realizes itself, actualizes itself at any time, but aren't of that deep inward necessity, that deep destiny, that destiny of the culture. I mean, that's how he would put it. That's exactly what he thinks. He thinks there's a destiny to each culture based on how that religious idea that forms the vitality of the culture will develop, and the fact that it has a set lifespan of about 1,000 years. And then finally he says, but even this proposed world history, this proposed Copernican world history, would be natural only to us, men of the West, and to us alone. So here is where he's trying to temper his kind of absolutist approach and trying to harmonize it with the doctrinaire relativism that he brings to the study of all the high cultures. So he's saying, this is the only approach to really understand world history, but within a Western framework. So my approach wouldn't be correct for every high culture, but it is the only correct approach for a Western world history. So maybe in the comments you can tell me whether you think that's convincing, whether you think that harmonizes his doctrinaire relativism as we apply it to all the high cultures, and his absolutist, exclusivist position that his is the only method by which a Western man can truly understand world history. Well, there you have it. Section 9 of the introduction of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks very much for your time. Have a great day.